thousands of women violated. Entire cities reduced to rubble. This is the story of the Second Sino-Japanese War. A war without rules, without compassion, but with much, much blood. Long before Europe ignited under the blast of bombs, the Asian continent was already bleeding. In 1937, a large-scale clash erupted between two giants, Japan and China. The spark was a dark episode near Beijing, at the Marco Polo Bridge, where a seemingly minor skirmish marked the beginning of a ruthless invasion. But what Tokyo imagined would be a swift, decisive campaign soon became a nightmare that consumed entire cities, caused millions of deaths, and opened a new front in the global arena. In this new documentary, we revisit the most brutal passages of the Sino-Japanese conflict, a battle that preceded and then merged with World War II, dragging with it one of the greatest human tragedies of the 20th century. The Marco Polo Bridge incident occurred on July 7, 1937, when Japanese troops stationed in Beijing mistakenly believed that one of their men had been captured by the Chinese. This misunderstanding unleashed the first battle and triggered a response from local forces against Tokyo's Navy vessels anchored in Shanghai. No one imagined that this would mark the start of an 8-year-long, brutal war.
Chiang Kai-shek's crack 88th Division made a suicidal attempt to stem the tide that flowed relentlessly against Shanghai. Japanese soldiers draw the fire of hidden machine guns, hoping to reveal the secret of their whereabouts. And then a desperate attempt by Japanese volunteers to smash down the lower windows. Setting fire to a shed nearby, the Mikado's troops endeavored to smoke out the doomed battalion. But under cover of that very smoke, 388 survivors escaped to British lines. They left behind 200 dead.
By December, the Imperial Japanese Army had seized Shanghai after a ferocious battle that left both sides exhausted and blood-soaked. But that was only the beginning. The next target in this spiral of violence was clear: Nanking, the capital of China. With more than 200,000 soldiers at the front, the Japanese advanced toward the city, driven by their recent victory, accumulated hatred, and a blurred chain of command that soon stopped distinguishing between combat and carnage. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre, a 6-week nightmare that would forever scar history. When Japanese troops stormed Nanking, they did so without rules, without soul, without humanity. The Chinese army had already collapsed. The Japanese now held thousands of prisoners of war, disarmed and surrendered. Their solution: execute them all, sometimes with gunfire, other times with the edge of a sword, and in some cases by forcing them into mass graves and burying them alive. These executions were joined by prisoners tied to posts as live targets or decapitations with katanas, where Japanese officers staged contests to see who could kill faster. Women were not spared. Pregnant women were ripped open with bayonets until they bled to death. Others endured sexual violence at atrocious levels. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped. Many were then tortured and killed. Among the victims were girls as young as 7 and elderly women over 70. Mercy did not exist.
ゆり子さんどうしてここに
These atrocities became the norm during the Nanking Massacre. It was systematic slaughter, a deliberate act of terror and one of the most infamous war crimes of the 20th century. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 300,000 people were murdered in just 42 days of horror. Civilians, surrendered soldiers, the elderly, children, no one was spared. The streets ran red, while the river carried away hundreds of bodies. This was the darkest face of the Eastern Front, and we have only just begun telling its story. While the empire of the rising sun advanced brutally across eastern China, the heart of the nation was already wounded. Because before the bombs, the gunfire, and the foreign invasion, China was already at war. Since 1927, the Asian giant had been torn apart by a relentless civil war. Two opposing visions, two conflicting ideologies, and leaders who could not imagine coexistence. On one side, the Kuomintang, the nationalist party led by Chiang Kai-shek, dreamed of a modern China unified under a centralized republic. On the other, the Chinese Communist Party, led by a stern and strategic man, Mao Zedong, who promised a peasant revolution and the end of bourgeois dominance. For years, China's fields, villages, and mountains became battlegrounds of equals, where alliances were fleeting and betrayals were common. Peasants, caught between both sides, suffered repression, executions, and purges. But everything changed in 1937 when Japanese troops crossed the Yellow River and ignited the fire of a new war. Faced with a foreign threat, mortal enemies had to suspend their internal struggle. For the first time, nationalists and communists were forced to share a common goal: resist the invasion. That's how a united front was formed, or at least appeared to be. Because although both sides collaborated to confront the invader, mistrust never disappeared. Tensions never eased. And on the margins of the front, civil war still simmered, waiting for its moment. In fact, when World War II ended with Japan's collapse, China's truce ended too, and its internal struggle returned with even greater force. But that is another story. By the late 1930s, the enemy was someone else, and resistance became the priority, even if it meant sacrificing everything to buy time and prevent the country from falling to Tokyo's rapid advance. The warriors gave their lives for their people. And when the Japanese realized that China would not fall quickly, they decided to burn it to the ground. After the resistance in cities like Changsha and the slow erosion of their supply lines, the Japanese High Command responded with brutality. Thus was born the policy of the three alls: kill all, burn all, loot all. This was more than a slogan. It was an order of annihilation. In regions suspected of harboring communist guerrillas, the directive was clear: leave no one alive. Soldiers, peasants, the elderly, women, children, everyone was a suspect. Everyone was a potential target. Entire villages were wiped out. Countless homes were set ablaze with their inhabitants still inside. Crops were burned, leaving people to starve. Schools were turned into death barracks. In many cases, Japanese soldiers executed every male over 15 years old as a precaution. Women were gang raped, some even after death, others in front of their children, who were then also killed. Prisoners were tied with barbed wire and thrown alive into wells. Villagers were forced to march across minefields. Farmers were hung upside down and slowly burned with boiling oil. This was not madness. It was doctrine. Every unit was ordered to leave behind a dead land, without resources, without shelter, and without witnesses. Millions of people fell victim to this strategy. And still, China did not surrender. It kept fighting.
At its furthest limits, Japan's invasion extends 1,000 miles from north to south, 1,000 miles from east to west. But still far from subdued are tens of thousands of square miles, even behind the Japanese lines. Regions ruled by guerrilla bands of Chinese, while Japan is forced to keep more than 500,000 men under arms.
Even as the years passed and Tokyo failed to break the Chinese people, Japanese ambitions expanded. On December 7th, 1941, as the sun rose over the Pacific, hundreds of planes soared across Hawaii's skies toward Pearl Harbor. In a matter of hours, they changed the course of world history. But what few remember is that on that same day, the Japanese Empire unleashed another storm in the heart of Asia. At the same time as the attack on the United States, Japan launched a lightning offensive against Allied colonial possessions in China. Within weeks, the rising sun flag flew over Hong Kong, and Western concessions in Shanghai were occupied without resistance. The war was no longer just between Chinese and Japanese. It was now a world war, and the inferno already raging in the northern fields spread like gunpowder across the east and south. In Shanghai and across Jiangsu province, the Japanese war machine was unleashed with renewed violence. Anti-guerrilla operations, reprisals against civilians, and a reign of terror left a horrifying toll. Nearly 100,000 Chinese citizens murdered in the following years. Bodies hung in town squares, communities erased, children executed for feeding communist fighters. No one escaped punishment, but perhaps the most silent hell was in Hong Kong. The British Pearl of the East, conquered in just 18 days, became a place of misery where hunger and disease reigned. What had once been a hub of trade and modernity became an open-air prison. The colony's population dropped from 1,600,000 to only 750,000. More than half disappeared into the shadows, dead from starvation or fleeing desperately into a ruined China. Yet the worst was still to come. With the Pacific War in full swing, the demand for labor grew to monstrous levels. Japan needed roads, railways, bases, airports, and it would not be their soldiers who built them, but their prisoners. In overcrowded trains, cages, or on foot, hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians were torn from their homes and deported to destinations as distant as they were inhumane. Southeast Asia became a vast field of forced labor. One of the most notorious hells was the so-called Death Railway between Burma and Thailand. More than 250,000 prisoners were sent there. The project, ordered by Tokyo, had to cross impenetrable jungles, infested rivers, and hostile mountains, and there was no machinery to achieve it, only men and whips. The conditions were indescribable, 16-hour days without rest, under a blazing sun and among malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Japanese guards beat those who could not keep pace with clubs. Many died and were buried beside the tracks. But that was not the only fate. Thousands of Chinese were sent as slave laborers to places as remote as New Guinea, Java, Borneo, or small islands lost in the immensity of the Pacific Ocean. There, they dug trenches, built airstrips, erected ammunition depots, and died without name or grave. Only a few ever returned home, and there are no records or tombs for those who perished along the way. Japan silenced them. Still, while all this unfolded in the shadows, The battle never rested. By 1942, China was encircled. On land, the Japanese army occupied nearly the entire surface. At sea, blockades and bombings prevented any help from the West. Resistance seemed near collapse. But then, the Allies bet on the impossible, an air route across the Himalayas known as the Hump. Its code name reflected what it was, a mountainous, deadly hump separating Assam in India from China's Yunnan province. At more than 5,000 meters high, amid violent winds, glaciers, and thunderstorms, a silent war was fought in the skies. American and Allied pilots flew old C-47s and C-46s, overloaded with ammunition, medicine, radios, and food. With no radar, no defined routes, and compasses that sometimes went haywire due to the mountain's magnetic pull. Many never returned. Here the most common enemies were not the Japanese, but altitude, lack of oxygen, ice on the wings, or storms. It is estimated that more than 600 planes were lost on the Hump route, and over 1,000 aviators died trying to cross it. Yet each completed mission meant another breath for Chinese resistance. Food reached guerrillas, and weapons reached nationalist troops. The Hump route was not just a logistical feat, it was what kept a nation alive when everything seemed lost. Resistance did not break, allowing the battle to extend into its final chapters. In August 1945, the world trembled. Europe lay silent in ruins, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reduced to ashes. Japan, the empire that had promised to last 1,000 years, was collapsing for the first time. Asia's bloodiest war was about to end. It was then that Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio. His voice announced surrender, not with clear words, but with an ambiguous formula: to endure the unendurable. In China, the echo of that broadcast resonated across every corner of the nation. After long years of massacres, rapes, famine, and resistance, the conflict was finally coming to an end. The formal surrender arrived on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But peace could not conceal the ruins, the corpses, the cities reduced to rubble. It had been 8 uninterrupted years of horror. 8 years in which China became an open battlefield where every river, every village, and every mountain bore witness to a savage war that claimed between 15 and 20 million lives. Most of them civilians. More than 200 major battles, tens of thousands of skirmishes, millions displaced, mass famines, and cities reduced to dust marked the path of a conflict in which more than 3 million Japanese soldiers took part, deployed across the continent with ferocity beyond limits. The Second Sino-Japanese War was far more than a parallel episode to the World War. It was a human abyss, a struggle for survival, and a grim reminder of how far brutality can go when power disguises itself as destiny. And so, we reach the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. Join us in our next installment as we continue discovering military history.